Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the book Pornography of Representation by Susanne Kappeler, and it's being discussed by Sheila Jeffries and Julia Long. So welcome Sheila and Julia, and over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So this morning, Sheila and I are going to be talking about this book. Oh, I've got that blurry screen, so you're not going to be able to see it. The Pornography of Representation. Maybe if I hold it, yeah, can't really see it. Which I chose to discuss because I read this book. Unlike some of the books that we've discussed here before, I didn't actually read them at the time. I read them some years later after they'd come out. But this one I read when it came out in the summer of 1986, because the writer Susanne Kappeler was actually my lecturer in English literature at the University of East Anglia, where I was studying at the time. And I must say, being taught by Sue, and there was another, I don't know if she was a radical feminist, another feminist lecturer there at the time as well, Sarah Beckwith. Being taught by both of those had such a huge influence on me, on my understanding. It introduced me to all these really important radical feminist ideas, and it was just a really, really exciting environment to be a student in. So I remember when this book came out, I think it was the end of my second year. It was that sort of the summer at the end of my second year, and I read it avidly. And I just remember absolutely loving the book, and actually feeling a huge sense of relief reading it, because what we'll go on to see is that it's quite a theoretical work, well, very theoretical work, and it's quite densely and forensically argued. And the course that I was doing in English literature at the time was it was quite heavy on critical theory, and it was the era of all the kind of post-structuralism and deconstruction. And I felt that what Sue Kappeler was doing in this book, she was really taking on some of this patriarchal theory and completely dismantling it and exposing the patriarchal nature of it. So I absolutely loved it at the time. And it's been quite an interesting experience. We'll come on and talk about Sheila's reaction and my reaction to the book, going back and rereading it, which I must say was really quite a different experience. But just to say a bit more about Susanne Kappeler, some women on the webinar may remember her. She wrote, as I remember, she wrote quite a lot of articles for Trouble and Strife, the radical feminist magazine. She wrote some brilliant articles for that, from what I remember. Her first couple of works were very kind of literature based. She wrote a book about Henry James, and she wrote a second book about teaching the text. Then she wrote, I'm sorry you can't see it more clearly, this Pornography of Representation. And then, as I recall, so in the next decade, in the 1990s, that came out in 86. In the 1990s, she wrote this one, which again, just can't really see it. It's called The Will to Violence. And then after that, to be honest, I can't find anything else that she's written, and she doesn't seem to have an online presence. So I remember she left UEA when I was there. And so kind of that's it, really. I just very much associate her work with introducing me to some fantastic radical feminist writers and thinkers and ideas at that time. And it's very much for me about my experiences as a student at that time. So Sheila, if I can hand over to you, and maybe you could tell us a bit about your reaction to the book when you first read it and now.
Okay. I think it's worked. Okay. Yes, so lovely to be here this morning talking about this, everybody. My introduction to the book really is because in 1984, 85, I mean, both years, I was teaching on the Changing Experience of Women course, which was the feminist introductory course to the OU, and it was, I think it was being taught at her university in 85, in fact. Sue Kappeler was there. And so I got to know her, which was great. And then in 85, I actually went off to teach in the US on a Fulbright scheme at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And when I came back in 86, I taught at the summer school again. And I think it must have been then that Susanne gave me the book, because it says in the front, for Sheila. And I remember really liking the book at the time. I think one reason was that not many radical feminist books were published in the UK. So it was great to see this one. I don't remember much about the content, though, from that time. And I didn't read it again until now for this webinar. And I was quite surprised, because the book is, as Julia says, densely theoretical. And only the first section of it is about pornography. The majority is literary theory, literary criticism, and and I don't fully understand all of that because it's not my area. I wasn't into it at all at any time. I think I liked it at the time, though, the book, because it was such a joy to see a book on pornography at that time. And in the UK, in the US, there'd been Susan Griffin's Pornography and Silence in 1981, and of course, Andrea Dworkin's marvelous Pornography, Men Possessing Women doesn't come till quite a bit later in 1990. So I was a little disappointed when I went back, because I know I had liked it at the time. But Julia, do you have anything else to say about your reactions?
Well, I suppose I said quite a bit already, but maybe I could just say a little bit more about what I remember of that time of being taught by Sue, because it was such a different experience to, I think, students experience now, not just in the, the whole point of having these radical feminist perspective webinars is because radical feminism has been so much pushed out of academia. But I think it's not only different in that regard, but also from when I was teaching in a uni, I don't know, about 6 or 7 years ago now. One of the things that struck me is that has really, really changed is the whole nature of the kind of, I suppose, like the sort of social contract between the lecturers and the students. And I think with the, when tuition fees were brought in, that was one of the things. Obviously, there's been a whole kind of marketization process, hasn't there, of the universities. And so now I think the degrees are seen much more as a kind of a commodity that students pay for because they're having to pay these tuition fees, and they want to get a good product at the end of, something that they can take out into the marketplace, into employment, and use in order to secure something that will bring them, it's like an investment, isn't it, for greater value. I really think that has been such a shift in that relationship between students and teachers, in that it was very much seen as a kind of like, this is my entitlement to get a good degree, and you have to make sure that happens, irrespective of the amount of work that I do or anything else. Whereas I think when I was studying this in the 80s, it was such a politicizing time for me, obviously in terms of radical feminism, but also just in access to Marxist ideas, all different kinds of political ideas. And it was very much in the context of a sort of active student politics at the time. And so for me, it was such a transformational experience, having my eyes opened and access to all of this work. And I just don't know that that it's really like that for students anymore. I mean, obviously there's a lot of student mobilization now around climate change and things like that. But I really felt there was quite a difference between the environment that I was studying in at the time, even though at UEA, it was still a very kind of like, it was a liberal arts type of environment, which was very patriarchal in its basis. And that's why Sue's work was so refreshing. But it just struck me what a different kind of, different kind of environment that the sort of transformations of academia over these past few decades, it brought up a lot of that for me as well. So shall we go on? I will now give a brief outline of the book, and then Sheila's going to talk more about the context of the book and the things that she was involved in at the time, and then we'll go on to look at the content of the book in a bit more detail. So Joe, if I could have the first slide, please, the overview slide. Thanks. So yeah, so it took me really rereading the whole thing and having quite a different experience of reading it. As Sheila said, I must say, when I first started reading it, I was quite disappointed, because I just remember being so enthusiastic about this book and reading it so avidly and just devouring it and feeling it was absolutely fantastic. And then going back and like, it was really, I felt it was quite an effort to get into it, and I couldn't really, yeah, it just wasn't as I remembered it. But the conclusion I've come to is the prominence of the word pornography in the title, I think is actually in some ways quite misleading, because although she takes pornography as the starting point for her analysis, what she actually does in the book is something, it's not an analysis of pornographic content, which is obviously, you know, a book like Andrea Dworkin's Pornography, you know, something like that. It's not that kind of project. What she says really early on is that she wants to shift the focus from an analysis of the content of pornography and seeing pornography as a form of sexuality. She wants to shift that and focus on looking at pornography as a particular form of representation. And that's what she's really interested in. And that's probably why I really enjoyed it at the time, because obviously in the studying of literature, I was studying all these different kinds of representations, literary representations and media representations and all of that. So the key term, I think, in the book is her idea or her analysis of what she calls the structure of representation. So she says right at the beginning, pornography is not a special case of sexuality, it's a form of representation. And then she talks about the nature of representations. And we're talking about representations here, not in terms of obviously like political representation, but in terms of media and communications and images. And what she says, I do think is really important. Representations are not just a matter of mirrors, reflections, or keyholes. You know, this idea that a work of literature or a piece of media reflects reality in some way. What she says is she draws attention to the material basis of representation. Someone is making them, somebody is looking at them through a complex array of means and conventions. So there are all these different kind of means and conventions which the producers of representations respond to and adhere to. They have, I can't see because the image is in the way. Right. They have a continued existence in reality as objects of exchange. So they go on, you know, in the ways that the you know, things that we see with pornography and things like, you know, so-called revenge porn, that images once created have an ongoing existence in reality as objects of exchange. They're not in this other realm of fantasy. They're used in social reality, and they have a genesis in material production. So she emphasizes the basis, a bit like Gail Dines, that there's a porn industry and these things are produced by men for, you know, various motivations, for the domination of women, for economic profit, etc. They have a material production. And she says, maybe a bit more controversially, they are more real than the reality they are said to represent or reflect. And the way that she illustrates what she means by the structure of representation is she takes this really horrible, upsetting article called "A Murder in Namibia," which was an article from the Guardian Weekly in 1984, an article about the racist murder of a young black farm labourer by the white farm owner, and he tortures him horrifically for a number of days first, and then murders him. And the article is accompanied by 3 images that were taken by the murderer and his friends. He invites his friends round and they're drinking and they're participating in this collective experience of the torture and murder of this young black man, the worker on the farm. And what Kappeler does is she does an analysis of not just the content, but of what she thinks is really important about that, which is the structure in terms of the male producer of these images and the audience and the collectivity of that, the way in which it establishes the relationship between the murderer and the other participants in it. And she uses that. She says what happens is these images then became used as evidence, but they weren't produced to be evidence in a court case. They were produced not just to reflect what was going on, but they were absolutely an integral part of the abuse. And she uses that as her basis for her. She uses that to suggest that relationship between the male producer and the male audience is the fundamental structure of representation that is what pornography is about, and that's what she's interested in. She then goes on in the sort of the first half of the book. She then sets out a radical feminist analysis of this structure of representation. She uses that to highlight the complete qualitative difference between the feminist perspective on pornography and what had been the dominant ones up to then, the conservative and liberal perspectives. And I know Sheila's going to talk a bit about those in the next section. So she takes issue with these notions, the kind of conservative notions of obscenity or the capacity that certain, that pornographic content may have to deprave a vulnerable viewer, ideas of censorship, this kind of question, the kind of liberal introduction of this idea of pornography versus erotica, and the idea of a kind of equal opportunities approach to pornography, where, oh, well, if women objectify men, then that kind of makes it more equal, this kind of thing. She takes issue with all of that. And again, it is in quite a densely argued way, but I think she does a very good job of dismantling all those arguments. And her main argument that I would say that she reaches is that she looks at the implications of, it's interesting that this term, the objectification of women, has really lasted over decades now. It's something that's become very commonplace in talking about pornography and other aspects of culture, the objectification of women. But what she says is that that's only one side of the coin. And what she's in a way more interested in is the way in which, through this structure of representation, men actually, it enables men to subjectify themselves, to put themselves in the subject position as the producer of the image or as the main actor in the image, using the woman's body or the body of the victim to manifest their subjectivity, and then the male audience then can identify with that. So in a way, it's a bit like Andrea Dworkin's thesis that pornography is fundamentally about the exposition of male power. It's a similar kind of thing, but she puts it into this literary kind of language. The next couple of parts, pornography as literature and the critique of culture, I'll talk about a bit later on. So Sheila, if you'd like to say a bit about the context that she was working in and your own involvement.
Yes, sure. Could we have the next slideshow? In fact, the sort of activist work that I was involved in around pornography at that time doesn't seem to have very much to do with this book, because the book obviously doesn't mention anything like that. And I don't think that Susanne was involved in that sort of anti-pornography activism. Her book is very theoretical. But I think it is worth looking at what the background was, which she must have been aware of, I would have thought, as a feminist in the UK at the time. And so I would just like to mention that in 1977, in London, some of us set up the London Revolutionary Feminist Consciousness Raising Group. I think this definition of pornography was actually written a bit earlier, probably in 78, and it went to a conference on sexuality in 1980, which is why it's in the wonderful collection, Women Against Violence Against Women, which is a record of 3 conferences of radical feminist thought on sexuality at that time, which I hope we will cover later. So what we did was we got our boyfriends to buy, because I had a boyfriend at that time, to buy pornography in sex shops and bring it to the group, and we analysed what was going on in it. And this was our definition. So I think this is from 78. We were the first anti-pornography activist group in the country. And we said pornography includes all forms of visual and verbal humiliation of women, for the sexual titillation of men, from page 3 in The Sun to striptease and flagellation movies, plus the exploitation and humiliation of women for economic gain, e.g. advertising, entertainment, etc. And of course, it's a radical feminist definition. It's not about whether pornography is obscene, whether it's liberating, and so on and so on. It's directly about the harm to women. I still quite like the definition, the visual and verbal humiliation of women. And of course, it's quite wide because it includes, women portrayed in certain ways in advertising, entertainment, and so on. So I think not bad as a go at defining all of that. So I'd like to go on now to looking at a wider context. Of course, at that time in that group, we were on the 10 o'clock ITV news, standing outside the local corner shop because it had pornography in it. The pornography we were talking about was magazines. We made a demonstration, an exhibition to take to a conference. It was all about bits from the different magazines. I don't think we wanted to watch the videos that were available at the time. So we were just, but there was nothing like the online pornography industry. That's what we need to understand through the whole of this, is that we're in a totally different context now. The pornography was very mild in a way. It had all the same structure as Kappeler is talking about, but it was mainly just many magazines in the local corner shop. So really different. So shall I just go on to talk about the wider context now? Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So in the book, Sue Kappeler explains the way that pornography was being understood at the time by the establishment and how wrong that was. Particularly, she references the Williams Commission on Obscenity and Film Censorship, which reported in 79 on how porn should be addressed in the law. And it was all about seeing pornography as whether or not it was acceptable to the man on the Clapham omnibus, whether it was obscene or not, how obscene it should be allowed to be, and so on. It was absolutely nothing whatsoever about recognizing that there could be any harm in it to women, even though it was very obvious that it was about women and putting women into certain situations. This was just not seen or recognized as in any way significant. Do you want to say anything about Williams, Julia, or shall I just go on?
Maybe just briefly, yeah. I mean, obviously, it was, but there wasn't that feminist voice within that, within that review. And as I remember, there was quite a lot about this very sort of liberal notion of like private freedom of, what someone should be quite free to, inverted commas, like enjoy in their own privacy, but the effect, if it was public, like that it could have the capacity to deprave someone who was not capable of dealing with that kind of content. There were lots of these notions of public and private, but it took there'd been the Longford Review, hadn't there, I think a few years earlier, so that really established
was better, I think.
Yeah, that established more of the kind of conservative positions, and then the Williams one established a lot of the liberal positions that she then sets out to really sort of show the shortcomings of. So yeah, but carry on, Sheila.
Thank you. So what Sue then goes on to do is to talk about what became the feminist sex wars. It was called the feminist sex wars. Radical feminists never called it that, of course, which was the profound disagreement that developed between feminists over pornography in the mid-1980s. I remember well that in the early 1980s, it seemed that the radical feminist view that pornography was violence against women, and that was the slogan that we spray painted on the windows of shops and so on. We said pornography is violence against women. We had stencils which said that, and we spray painted onto the windows of any shops that had pornography at that time. So we saw pornography as violence against women, and we said it was violence against women. I don't think that's even said now. The language on pornography now is very, very tame, apart from Gail Dines and a small number. But we'll talk about that at the end, how there isn't any of this kind of activism against pornography now, really. So at that time, early 80s, I think we thought we could change public opinion, we could make huge differences, we could actually get rid of pornography. I think we did. Extraordinary idea. But then, of course, we had a huge shock because some feminists, many feminists, mainly socialist feminists and liberal feminists, came out in opposition to us. And they opposed any restrictions on pornography. And this happened in the US in response to the Dworkin-McKinnon anti-pornography ordinance in 1984. And in the UK, the feminists who came out against us didn't create a formal network until 1989, when they set up Feminists Against Censorship as a national capital to civil liberties conference to oppose anti-pornography legislation, because, of course, a civil liberty for men, a very, very, very important one, is pornography. So obviously they had to set up a campaign to fight us. Now, Kappeler examines some of the arguments that the feminist defenders of porn made, because like Williams and all the male establishment defenders, they fail to see that pornography is any kind of problem for women in any way. They adopt free speech arguments, and they see porn as potentially women's speech, and argue that it consists of women's sexual freedom. I know, extraordinary, but that is how they opposed us. So could we go on to another slide, Jo? Yes, now Deirdre English at the top here, she's an American feminist, American socialist feminist. And Sue Kappeler quotes her as an example of what these feminists who chose to defend pornography and oppose us, how she talked about pornography. She says, what we need, even more than women against pornography, that was us lot, are women pornographers or eroticists, if that sounds better. So the answer for feminists was they should, get out there, get their boots dirty and start producing the pornography for other women. And that was the way to go. So no understanding whatsoever of the structure of pornography, what it meant for women or anything. There's a huge amount of stuff by feminists saying this kind of thing. That's why there was a feminist sex wars in the mid-1980s. This is, of course, a very, very different point of view from Andrea Dworkin, who she doesn't quote, because this is probably later than that. But Andrea says beautifully, erotica is simply high-class pornography, better produced, better conceived, better executed, better packaged, designed for a better class of consumer. So yes, erotica is, it's got perhaps slightly nicer knickers in it. But obviously the structure, what's going on in it, is exactly the same as in ordinary male stream pornography. I just mentioned the ordinance. Can you take that one down, Jo? The anti-pornography ordinance in the US was created in 1984. A state, I think it was Minneapolis, asked Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon to create an anti-pornography ordinance to deal with pornography in that state. And it's been very, very, very important to all discussions of pornography since. And their understanding was that pornography was a civil rights ordinance. It wasn't censorship. It wasn't saying that this is too offensive or shouldn't be out there. It was a civil rights ordinance. It looked at whether the pornography harmed women, that is, the women used in it, or the women who would then have to have it used upon them, and so on. And in that sense, it was kind of revolutionary, was really important. And when I went out to teach in the US in 1985, 1986, I was able to go around, and I went to the promotional events for the ordinance. And I went to showings of the New York Women Against Pornography slideshow, which were often shown. These were just pictures from magazines, and the one I remember most was of a meat grinder, and a woman is being put headfirst into the meat grinder. I can't remember whether this was Playboy or Penthouse, one of the two.
I think it was Hustler.
Oh, was it Hustler? Yeah, Hustler. And she had her legs obviously shaved and with high-heeled shoes on them, waving out of the top of the meat grinder. So, you know, it might appear to some of us this is very obviously hate speech that is actually grinding up members of an oppressed group for your own sexual satisfaction. Anyway, I was going to those. I was meeting Janice Raymond, and many of her ex-students were involved in promoting the ordinance. I met Catherine McKinnon and so on. When I came back to Britain, I brought the anti-pornography slideshow of New York Women Against Pornography, and this led to me getting sacked from the Open University Summer School. I noticed that Bridget in the chat, Bridget Lettner, talks about having been on the last one of these summer schools. I was already sacked, so unfortunately, I did not meet her at there, but they were very, very exciting, the summer schools. And I showed, you had to do an optional session in the evening, apart from your teaching during the day, as part of the contract. So I said I'd show the Women Against Pornography New York slideshow, which had the Hustler image and other images, which would not be seen as, I think, particularly terrible now. And what happened was that I then got a letter from the woman organizing the summer school who told me I couldn't be employed again because I had caused distress to women by showing these slides, which in the US, everybody was going around and showing. There were events everywhere, but it's too dangerous to show. This one was a socialist feminist who was running the summer school. She thought it was not okay. But I do remember what was very interesting showing it at the summer school was that there was a customs officer, a woman customs officer there, whose job, it was completely women-only ordinance, or audience. Her job was that she had to look at the pornography as it came into the country to see whether it could be sold, whether it was too obscene or whatever. And she talked about the extreme distress that she experienced in having to look at it and decide whether it was acceptable. So this is a whole sort of other workforce of women that are having to deal with men's sexual violence that I think nobody would normally think about. So it was in the context of the sex wars and of the ordinance that the book was written. Can you show another slide, Jo? Yes, this is my favorite quote from the book. It's about Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, which was plates dedicated to 39 famous women with designs on them which were supposed to be related to genitals. So it was understood that this was female genitals on all of the plates, even though they were very stylized and you couldn't have told that by looking at them. And it was celebrated at the time. It's still extremely celebrated and very, very, very famous, and made her famous in a way that her other art did not. And Susanne Kappeler says very sensibly, what would feminists have thought about The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago if it had been created by a man? Honoring great women in history by making dinner plates of their vaginas. And of course, that is true. Who on earth would think that Virginia Woolf deserved to be represented by genitals? I mean, completely extraordinary, terrible, terrible disrespect for famous women in history. And yet this was at the time seen by all those who were progressive as a wonderful, wonderful artistic product, not by Sue Kappeler. And I love her for saying this so clearly. She says the woman artist bears her credentials apparently in her genitals. Wonderful stuff. Okay, so can you take that down, Jo, and we'll go on to Julia, who's going to talk about the main message of the book.
Yeah, Jo, can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. Okay, so for sort of the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to try and give an overview of how Susanne Kappeler developed her argument in the book. And as we were saying, you know, it is quite it's quite forensically argued and it's quite densely theoretical, so I'll do my best. So we kind of left off before where she was really arguing for the importance of the analyzing the structure of representation of pornography and how that works and what that kind of achieves in terms of male domination. Part of that is that she's very insistent, as I was saying, on the material basis of pornography. The fact that I think she felt that a lot of the discussion around pornography was very much focused on the content, as if these images just kind of exist. It's this phenomenon that exists. But she was very insistent on the fact that there are choices, decisions, agreements, transactions, all involved in the creation of these representations, and that's what she wanted. And then the consumption of them. So she was interested, I suppose, in a way, in the kind of the economics and sociology of the whole kind of production of these representations, and then how they functioned in society. And she moves on from that to do quite a kind of a wholesale critique of the publishing industry, because she's interested, and I think this is where it is very striking that the book is very much of its time, because the only pornography that she really talks about is literary pornography in terms of words rather than images. And obviously, if we think about pornography now, it's very much about the online content, which has become so dominant and so kind of universally accessible to men. But she's particularly interested in how certain types of pornography get elevated to the status of literature and these notions of art. And you can kind of see the thread from the Williams review going right through here, that she talks about the way in which the literary establishment creates a kind of, she calls it a literary sanctuary, where the only consideration of some of this really grotesquely violent and just horrible pornography. She quotes some really horrible sections from this book called The White Hotel, which was seen as this sort of great literary work at the time. And she talks about how the whole kind of publishing industry and the whole literary establishment creates this kind of, what she says is this sanctuary where the only consideration is of aesthetics. And through the romantic myth of the artist, who's always obviously this male figure, whose genius sets him apart from the rest of society, how he isn't expected to take any kind of political responsibility for the representation, as she calls it, for his literary output in the world, that he is absolved of all that kind of responsibility through just this consideration of aesthetics. And that's how some of the, this violent literary forms of pornography gets elevated to the status of where it's beyond political criticism anyway. It's just seen as, you can criticize it in terms of its aesthetics, but not in terms of its kind of political implications and consequences. So she kind of argues in the central part of the book about that. Can I have the next slide, please, Jo? Thank you. And then she talks about how some critics who may ostensibly start off as supposedly feminist critics then get shift into sort of having this loyalty to the literary establishment, and they become literary critics rather than feminist critics. And she does this through a consideration of, like, returning to this her basic idea of the structure of representation. She goes back to thinking about how women are represented within the pornographic structure, that women are this kind of basically the means, the object by which the male writer, the male subject, and the male viewer both kind of get this feeling of dominance, of their subjectivity, of the one sort of being in charge. And so she uses this pretty vile quote from the Marquis de Sade, quoted in Angela Carter's book on Sade, The Sadean Woman. And she uses this is a really central quote that she returns to over and over again to show basically the kind of wrong think of or the misguided nature of the likes of someone like Carter, who ostensibly may start off as a sort of a feminist critic, but then ends up very much being loyal to the men in the literary establishment. So here, Sard is supposedly addressing women directly, and please forgive this horrible quote, but I think it's important because she makes such a she really does go back to this over and over again. So he says, charming sex, you will be free. The charming sex obviously being women. Just as men do, you shall enjoy all the pleasures that nature makes your duty. Do not withhold yourselves from one. Must the more divine half of mankind be kept in chains by the other? Ah, break those bonds, nature wills it. So from this quote, Carter then says, quite staggeringly, I think, when for those of us who know like the output and also the whole history, the horrific life of violence against women that Sard led, and the really hideously violent output that he wrote. It's quite staggering that Carter then says, I would like to think that he put pornography in the service of women. So what Kappeler is saying, just purely looking at the structure, she says that what Sard is saying here is that, oh, if only women would break free from their chains, they too could enjoy all of this pornographic ethics that men enjoy. And she says that clearly it's men who are setting the stage, men who are determining what will happen. And even in this quote, he even invokes the idea of nature to support his idea of women's role, because he says it doesn't even make sense in terms of sheer logic, because he's saying you shall enjoy all the pleasures that nature makes your duty. So on one level he's saying you will be free, but then he's talking about this duty that women are impelled to fulfill through nature, because it's supposedly women's nature. So so it's inevitable in Sard's scenario that women will be victimized by men, and the only supposed agency, which obviously was a term that went on to be really completely overused to a nauseating degree by liberal feminists a decade later, the only agency is that women are allowed in this scenario is that she can choose how to respond. So she can either choose to remain as a victim in that role, or she can supposedly throw off this, but she can be so she can, all she can choose is which attitude to take to her preordained role, which is either that of victim or libertine. And I think in that analysis of that quote and Carter's response to it, I feel that Susanne Kappeler really astutely basically anticipates what would then go on to be the whole kind of supposedly like liberal feminist response to pornography that would be very, very dominant for the next couple of decades, which is basically all of these things which, as Sheila was saying, feminists had a thoroughgoing analysis of and opposition to as violence against women. Suddenly all the, even the very worst of these things were all seen as empowering and a matter of consent and choice. So that's a really important quote that she does a really good sort of hatchet job on. So can I have the next slide, please, Joe? So the final three chapters, I think, really go on to develop the main thesis of the book, which is where she makes this shift from the critique of pornography and the pornography as art or literature that she talks about, in those earlier chapters. And this is where it does get very theoretical. The final chapters are called Collaboration, Communication, and then Sex, Sexuality. And she does have a couple of postscripts at the end of those, which I'm going to talk about as well. But this is where she makes this shift, still using this idea of the structure of representation as the basis of her argument. So she's gone from a critique of pornography, quite a theoretical one, to the critique of the publishing industry, the literary establishment, And now she's going on still considering how this idea of representation forms the basis of culture under patriarchy, under male domination. And she just really kind of goes for it then in terms of establishing or developing a really thoroughgoing critique of the whole nature of culture with a capital C under patriarchy. So I'll do my best to summarize what she's saying in these final chapters. So Jo, next slide, please. So in this chapter that she calls collaboration, and I must admit, I'm not entirely sure why she calls it collaboration, but I think maybe it's the way. Yeah, I won't even try to theorize that, but to me that title was maybe a slightly confusing title for this chapter. But as I say, she's shifting now into the whole idea of the production of representations across the board. And so she shifts into the whole realm of what she calls modern capitalist consumer society, which again was a very, very different world to the one that we're in, whatever, 40 years later, in terms of, or the technologization of this society. That was a very different picture that she's looking at. So she's saying that we have to think of pornography in the context of this wider cultural production that is all male dominated. And so she says there are all these continuities. The pornographer is a producer of a form of culture, a form of representation. The published author is a producer. The reader is a recipient. The process, she's saying, is one way. And what she says here is that it is the way that culture becomes a kind of a reified version of communication, where because communication is so much about representation is so much about the male subject establishing himself and putting himself kind of out there as this sort of dominant force in the culture, that culture becomes this series of representations which are all in effect male monologues, whether it's in literature or film or art or whatever. So she says representations, compositions, whether they're in literature or whatever form of medium, representations, compositions that determine our perspective and how we look at things are a crucial strategy in the supreme subject, i.e. men, i.e. patriarchy, the supreme subject's endeavor to maintain his position of power and privilege and the social, political and economic organization that supports it. So she's saying quite a lot in that one sentence, but she's basically saying that under patriarchy, culture with a capital C is in the service of maintaining male power and privilege and all the kind of social and political and economic organization that supports it. So she's really going into a very kind of wider realm of cultural critique here. And so what she's saying is that what we have as culture, or what she was observing around her then as culture, is a very commodified form of communication. And communication is the title of the next chapter. She's saying that communication has been reified into all these consumer objects. That the whole function of communication, rather than being an egalitarian process of I'm anticipating a bit what comes in the next chapter of kind of alternating roles of speaker and listener and sharing of perspective. She's saying that communication becomes reified as a product. Communication is for sale. Communication is industrially produced. The speaking function of the communication is turned into a means of production, and the listening function into consumption. So as I say, we are going into sort of a fairly more theoretical realm here of how she's making the leap from the analysis of pornography into this wider cultural critique. I think hopefully it will become a bit clearer in the next slide. Can I have the next slide, please, Jo? Okay, so in the chapter on communication, she considers how we usually think of communication, what communication could be, and in some circumstances can be and is. She thinks of communication, the role of language in communication, as an instrument of collectivity, of social interaction. And she uses, this is obviously a term from literature, of establishing intersubjectivity. And I think what she means by that is that the roles of a much more egalitarian view of communication, of having these exchangeable roles of speaker and listener, and not being communication not being reified into one dominant voice, becomes the voice of a particular group, i.e. men, as being the speakers, and then the listener just being reduced to this sort of passive consumer. Now, in some ways, we could say, well, this is a bit at odds with what she was saying before about the male producer and the male audience. She's kind of parted company with this a bit when she's talking about male dominated culture, because she's seeing it much more as a kind of a one-way process. So anyway, what she says in developing her argument is that in patriarchal culture, in male dominated culture, the community of communication is chopped up, segmented into distinct individual roles. We can observe, and this is really, I think, the main thesis of the book, we can observe a general cultural tendency towards monologue. You might be thinking the same about me now, because I'm giving quite a monologue here. And in fact, it is a bit ironic because you're reading the book, because you're thinking, well, this is kind of what you're doing in the book. But she's saying we can observe a general cultural tendency towards monologue in lieu of speech and counter speech, in lieu of dialogue and interaction. And I think what she's talking about here is a process of social subordination, of a dominant group establishing dominance over a subordinate group. But she's using this very kind of literary theoretical language to do it. And she says that speaking, self-expression, the idea of speaking as a kind of manifestation of the self, or the way of the self kind of articulating itself in the world, is the product of the project of the male culture subject. So she's saying pretty much the entirety of culture, with a capital C, as being the project of the male culture subject. And if we go on to, I'm coming up to the last couple of slides here, I think the quote on the next slide, I'm going to have the next slide, please, Joe. Yeah, this is basically the conclusion that she comes to, is that women are the generic object of culture, and culture is the monologue of the male gender. So it's just this endless output, this endless reiteration of the same structures of representation in order to objectify women, in order to manifest a kind of a relationship of dominance, a relationship of power of men over women. So I think, but she kind of comes to that conclusion through all this rather, as I say, rather forensically argued literary theory. That's how she reaches this conclusion. So what I think is interesting in terms of, how long have we got? Oh, we've only got about 5 minutes, but she does raise, I think, some quite interesting questions, and I think there are some obvious challenges to her book. So in her postscript, she says, like, basically, what do we do about all this? And she says, feminist critique must involve forms of communication that are neither ego trips nor solid objects, but forms of exchange and intersubjectivity. And this is her big argument, that we have to shift from this culture of monologue to intersubjectivity. So could we have the final slide, please? Oh, it's not quite the final slide. So she says, this is her summary: my argument has not been concerned with practical measures, which I think is true. I think both Sheila and I very much observe this. Has not been concerned with practical measures which we could take today or tomorrow in order to get rid of the problem of pornography. I've tried to show that there is no such isolated problem of pornography. So she's put it in the context of this much wider patriarchal culture. But one of the things that she sees as essential is that women's creative practice is essential to transforming the structure of representation. And she says that women's creative practice is very important, but it won't be a kind of commodifying practice, which it won't produce art for the museums and products. It arises from a changed consciousness of what culture and its practices are. It would be dialogic, multi-logic, and an end to the pornologic. And so I think it begs a lot of questions. Although she does call this last chapter Practical Perspectives, I wonder if she did that because there's such an absence of a kind of a real material practical application, really, of what she's saying. It does exist more as a theoretical critique. So the very last slide, I wonder if we could maybe just go over time by a couple of minutes to have a brief think about how relevant is the book now. So Sheila, I wonder what you think about some of these questions. Do you think that the book is in any way still relevant now? Is the fact that she focuses on literature, is that in any way still relevant? We're in a dramatically changed context of the internet, the global online pornography industry, the pornification of society. To me, I think the book does anticipate liberal feminism, but I don't think her practical perspectives are particularly practical. So, Sheila, would you like to have a final few thoughts on the relevance of the book now, or lack of?
What's interesting in a way is that there was a book that purported to be, even if it wasn't exactly, about pornography at all, because these days there is nothing. There is no discussion amongst feminists or anybody else about pornography. There's no theorizing of pornography. There's no activism. There's nobody outside the corner shop protesting. I think one reason for that, apart from the total destruction of feminism that has taken place, is that magazines are not what pornography is about now. I mean, in those days, anybody could go in their corner shop, pick up the magazines. This is what pornography was. It was much less common. I think far less men used it. It wasn't just absolutely everywhere. But now women are very unlikely indeed to go into looking at porn online. It's very distressing even to look at the titles. Very different situation from the magazine. So I think now it's, though some women may use pornography and be involved in it, the great majority can just ignore it, put it off to one side, don't know what's in it, don't have to say about it. We can't talk about it in the same way and show the page of the magazine in the way that it could back in those days. So
maybe,
yeah, sorry.
Maybe Sheila, maybe just to say, I mean, I do agree with you. I think what's happened obviously in the last, I don't know, 6 years or so has been that the activism has been so directed at all the transgenderism and gender identity stuff, and the kind of the activism like out in the world has been very much directed around that. And I think that has kind of consumed so much energy just to establish or to defend the definition of the word woman. I think a lot of energy has gone into that. But I was involved in a brilliant march just early in May of this year. If you remember, there was the Manchester march organised by the Northern Radical Feminist Network, who I have to say, I just feel they're such a powerhouse up there. And with all the speeches that went on there was obviously such an appetite to talk about this. And there's huge concerns, particularly for young women and the world that the younger women and girls are growing up in. So I do think there is the potential for some kind of, it's ironic because my book was obviously called The Resurgence of Anti-Porn Feminism, which was something that was happening sort of 10, 15 years ago, but less so now. And maybe I should mention as well, I know that someone is a feminist, is writing a book on pornography at the moment, but it's probably confidential to, probably shouldn't say her name at this point. I don't know if she'd want that to be known, but I know she's definitely working on that. So hopefully that will really go some way to creating more of a mobilization around this again.
Yes, I think that what should be most significant today is the way that the porn revolution and online pornography and the expansion of the industry is now constructing culture in ways that we would have found very unusual or surprising in the 1970s. It is, of course, constructing and promoting men's sexual fetishes, all the online communities and so on, and they're going out into the outside world. I mean, nappy fetishism, transvestism, all of this is being constructed by specialized pornographies and moving into the world, demanding rights, getting legislation on their side, and transforming the way that culture is, the world in which women have to live, in a way which obviously was not really true of just of the pornography magazines of the 1970s and 80s. So that's absolutely huge. And I feel we're firefighting. We're trying to deal with the manifestations, specifically manifestations, of pornography in the real world now, all the forms of male sexual practice, women in ordinary heterosexuality getting strangled of the sexual practice and so on. So we're firefighting.
Yeah.
We're not looking at the industry. That's somehow hidden away from ordinary women's view. We're not seeing that, and we haven't found a way of confronting it. So that's the problem. There's this massive engine of male sexual violence going on almost completely untouched or looked at, and it's transforming in a terrible way the world in which women live.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, like that term pornification, you know, that has been around for a long time now, the whole, you know, observing of the mainstreaming of pornography into the culture. But obviously what keeps happening is that it just, as pornography has become more extreme and more violent and more sadistic, that what we're seeing within the culture equally that is becoming, you know, normalized in really quite terrifying ways is equally the sort of valorization of sadism. You know, there was, you probably saw, there was that article recently about oh, the civil service has banned people wearing like SM gear to work, and you just think the thought that that is even possible as a headline, the fact that that is even possible is really quite unthinkable.
It's
it used to be
extraordinary.
about whether
Men's
you
sexual
could wear,
violence and perversions have been so normalized.
yeah,
There's no
yeah,
question.
exactly. So anyway, we will be later on, I think towards the end of October, I know Leah and I will be discussing my book about the resurgence of pornography, of anti-pornography feminism at that time, which was around about sort of the 2010 kind of era, 2010 to you know, those about sort of 5 years around then. So we'll be revisiting some of this. Obviously it'll be coming a bit more up to date, but you know, since then obviously there's been far more of you know, just as you say, these more and more kind of extreme fetish behaviors that are just being
and now in schools they say children should be taught how to deal with pornography. Not that there shouldn't be any pornography. It's an extraordinary situation that
exactly exactly the kind of way to deal with it is media literacy, like this kind of this kind of thing. So anyway, I think we're up to time. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you very much, Sheila, for persevering.
It's been lovely to talk with you, Julia.
Yeah, you as well, Sheila. That was great. Thank you very much. Thanks then. Okay, bye-bye. I'll finish it.